Get ready for the unknown. If you love feeling the chill down your spine and venturing into stories that will take your sleep away, subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell. Don't miss the next horror tales that will take you to the darkest corners of your mind. Are you ready to face your fears? Portal is open. Enter.
Marcos was new to the job. After losing his previous job, he accepted a position as a driver on the early shift. He didn't believe in superstitions, and the stories about the mysterious passengers seemed like just exaggerated rumors to scare newcomers. He laughed when his coworker, Carlos, warned him on his first night. "Work and don't stare at him for too long," Carlos had said, looking serious. Marcos thought it was ridiculous. "Spirits? I don't believe in that nonsense," he muttered, starting the bus that rainy night. The city was deserted, the streetlights flickering in the reflection of the puddles. At midnight, the loneliness of the streets began to weigh on him, but he kept his eyes on the road, hoping that his night would be just one of many. As he passed the penultimate point, the wind blew hard, shaking the trees. As he approached the last point on the outskirts, a shiver ran up Marco's spine. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the silence inside the bus, the distant hum of the city, suddenly seemed heavy. He parked, ready to continue his journey without expecting anyone. Until the automatic door opened by itself. Marcos froze, feeling his heart beat uncontrollably. A tall man with a dark hat and a hidden face got on the bus. His footsteps were almost inaudible, and he didn't make eye contact. He simply walked to the back of the bus and sat down. The driver tried to take a deep breath, telling himself that he was just an ordinary passenger, but something inside him screamed the opposite. The journey continued in absolute silence. Marcos looked through the rearview mirror, trying not to focus on the man in the background, but curiosity ate away at him. The strange passenger didn't move, didn't make a sound. The bus glided through the empty streets, and the rain poured down the windows, creating an unsettling melody. Just one more stop to go, Marcos thought, his mind racing. He needed to end the journey, but something wasn't right. When he stopped at the final point, he breathed a sigh of relief. That would be the moment when everyone got off. He opened the door, expecting the man at the bottom to get up. However, he remained seated, motionless. Marcos looked in the rearview mirror again, expecting any movement. "Nothing. Sir, this is the last stop," he said, his voice shaking slightly. No reply. Marcos turned to face him directly, but when he looked at the empty seat, he realized that the man had disappeared. A chill went through his body. He checked the entire bus, every seat, every corner, but there was no sign of the man. The passenger had vanished without a trace. Unable to believe his eyes, Marcos accelerated back to the garage. His thoughts were mixed. This can't have happened. It can't be real. When he arrived, he told his colleagues what had happened, trying not to look frightened. Carlos, the driver who had warned him, just shook his head with a gloomy look on his face. "I told you, he always comes back, Marcos. Don't try to understand. Just follow his route and pray that he never does more than just travel." Over the next few days, Marcos tried to forget the incident. He kept telling himself that the man's disappearance could have a logical explanation. Maybe there was something he hadn't noticed. But each night, fear began to creep deeper into his mind. The emptiness of the bus, the lengthening shadows in the deserted streets, and the eerie silence made each journey a terrifying experience. On the fifth night, the rain fell harder, and the fog made it difficult to see ahead. Marcos nervously approached the last point on the outskirts, the place where the mysterious man always embarked. This time, he hesitated before opening the door, his fingers trembling over the control. But, as expected, the door opened by itself. The passenger climbed back on, his dark hat covering his face, and made his way to the back of the bus. Marcos tried to stay calm, repeating Carlos's advice. "Don't look at him too much. Just do your job." But the man's presence was suffocating, a darkness that seemed to fill the room. As he passed the next few points, Marcos noticed something different. The city was more deserted than usual. Not a single pedestrian, not a single car. It was as if time had stopped. At the final stop, the same ritual. The bus stopped, the doors opened, but the man didn't move. This time, however, something changed. The air around the bus became freezing, and an overwhelming sense of dread gripped Marcos. He slowly turned to face the man, but before he could speak, he saw a darker shadow emerge from his hat. The man's face was finally showing, and it wasn't human. What Marcos saw made him scream and back away from his seat. The face under the hat was not flesh and blood, but an empty mask of darkness. Where the eyes should have been, there were black holes, and the mouth was a deformed line of pain and muted screams. The creature stared at him with an evil hunger, a presence so intense that it seemed to drain the air from the bus. The driver tried to get off the bus, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was trapped, frozen by fear, as the being slowly rose from its seat. Each step it took towards Marcos seemed to last an eternity. The sound of his shoes hitting the floor echoed, as if they were in an empty tunnel, far from any reality. "Why me?" Marcos managed to mutter, his voice hoarse with dread. The creature stopped, tilting its head in a grotesque gesture. "Because you're driving on the road of the dead," whispered an ancient voice, echoing like the sound of hundreds of lost souls. The bus door closed with a loud slam, and the vehicle began to move on its own. Marcos, unable to control the steering wheel, saw the city lights disappear. The bus was no longer on its normal route. The familiar streets were replaced by a deserted road, surrounded by dead trees and a thick fog. Marcos didn't know if he was alive or dead, but one thing was clear. He was no longer in his town. The being went back to the back of the bus, disappearing into the shadows, while Marcos found himself trapped in an endless nightmare. Days turned into nights and nights into days, but Marcos never returned to the garage. The city he once knew seemed like a distant fragment of memory. The bus rolled along a road that never seemed to end, always on the edge of the unknown, always shrouded in fog. The only constant was the passenger in the back, who appeared every time Marcos stopped the bus. He was always there, watching, waiting, like a silent death sentence. Marcos tried to escape countless times, but each attempt ended in failure. The door never opened, the windows never cracked. He was trapped in an endless cycle of terror, condemned to drive forever on the road of the dead. What began as a simple night job turned into a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. One day, another driver took over his route, and, as Carlos had done before, he gave the same warning. Watch out for the last point on the outskirts. If he comes in, do your job and don't look at him for too long. Time had lost its meaning for Marcos. He no longer knew how many days, weeks, or months he was stuck on that endless road, driving the bus in a cycle of despair. Sometimes the sun rose, other times darkness reigned without end. The only sound that accompanied him was the bus engine and the occasional rustle of the dead trees that lined the road. The mysterious passenger, always present, continued to sit at the back, his silhouette a terrifying constant in the gloom. Marcos tried to understand what was happening, but his mind was in pieces. He remembered the creature's words, the road of the dead. But what did that mean? Was he dead? Stuck in some kind of purgatory? One day, while driving along this gloomy road, he noticed something different. a figure on the side of the road, waving at him. Against all his instinctive refusals, Marcos stopped the bus. The door opened by itself, and a woman got on. She was young, but her face was distorted, as if it had been sculpted from melted wax. "You're under arrest, aren't you?" she said, in a voice that was almost melodic but laden with pain. "You're not the first to pass this way. I've seen many like you, all condemned to drive forever." Marcos felt a chill. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice breaking. The woman laughed softly, but her laughter was empty. "I used to be a passenger, just like you. Now, I'm just another forgotten soul here, waiting for the same thing as you. A way out. But there is no way out." With each passing night, the bus stopped at increasingly strange points. At one of them, Marcos saw a stooped figure wearing an old suit, his eyes empty of any emotion. The man got on the bus without a sound, sitting down next to the woman with the distorted face. Then more passengers began to board. A faceless child, a lady with gray, wrinkled skin, and a man whose half of his body was covered in burns. Each took a seat in silence, as if they knew exactly where they were supposed to sit. The bus, once empty, was now full of dead people, their presences silent and disturbing. Marcos tried to speak, to ask for help, but his words seemed to disappear into the heavy air of the vehicle. The original passenger, the man in the hat, remained in the background, watching everything without moving a muscle. Marcos could feel his invisible eyes burning towards him, as if he was waiting for something to happen. The new passengers didn't communicate with each other, but there was a tension in the air, a feeling that they were trapped in a terrible cycle, unable to escape. Marcos' despair grew by the second, his sanity slowly crumbling. The bus was no longer just a vehicle, it was a prison, and the passengers, condemned like him, were there for a reason. But what? One day, the woman with the melted face spoke again. "They're not leaving, you know. They're just like you, trapped in their own nightmares, forced to relive the terror of their last trip forever. You see them like that, but they've already forgotten who they were." Her voice was a distant echo, as if it came from a place far beyond that reality. Marcos began to notice that the bus was never truly empty. Every time it stopped at a new point, more bizarre figures would board, taking up seats without making a sound. He tried not to look at them, but their presence was impossible to ignore. The faceless boy always turned his head in his direction, as if waiting for Marcos to say something. But he never did. Every night, the bus seemed heavier, slower, as if it were being pulled into an abyss. The environment around the bus also began to change. The dead trees seemed to bend more, their long branches twisted like fingers, trying to catch up with the moving bus. At times, Marcos could swear he heard whispers coming from outside, voices calling his name, trying to draw him out. "Have you ever wondered what happens if you get off the bus?" said the woman with the distorted face, now always in the same seat, her hands intertwined in her lap. "I can't leave," Marcos replied, his voice faltering. "There's no way out." The woman smiled disturbingly. "Exactly. There's no way out, but you can be dragged into something worse." Marcos tried to ignore her, but the feeling that the bus was heading toward a final destination, a place of complete damnation, grew stronger. With every turn, the road seemed to narrow more, the sky darkened, and the fog around the bus became thicker, almost suffocating. "I can't leave," Marcos replied, his voice faltering. "There's no way out." The woman smiled disturbingly. "Exactly. There's no way out, but you can be dragged into something worse." Marcos tried to ignore her, But the feeling that the bus was heading toward a final destination, place of complete damnation, grew stronger. With every turn, the road seemed to narrow more, the sky darkened, and the fog around the bus became thicker, almost suffocating. And then, one night, the passenger at the back, the man with the hat, finally stood up. As the man with the hat approached, the air inside the bus turned dense and suffocating. Marcos couldn't breathe, his chest tight with terror. The man walked down the aisle, his shoes hitting the floor with a hollow sound. He stopped next to Marcos, but didn't look directly at him. "You're here because you deserve it," the man said, his voice as cold as death itself. Marcos, overwhelmed with indescribable fear, managed to murmur, "Why? What did I do?" The man laughed, a deep, sinister sound that echoed through the bus. "You forgot. All of you forgot." He leaned closer, and Marcos finally saw what was hidden beneath the hat. A dead, rotting face, with flesh hanging off, eyes empty of life, but filled with hatred. "You were never a driver. You were a passenger, just like them." The man's words pierced Marcos like a knife. Everything began to unravel in his mind. He remembered now. He wasn't a driver. He was one of the passengers. He had died years ago in a bus accident. The very same bus. He and all the others had been reliving the same damnation, night after night, trapped in an eternal cycle of despair. The passengers around him began to transform, their faces dissolving, revealing their true natures. Lost souls, deformed by the violent deaths they had suffered. The bus was not just a means of transport. It was a prison for the damned, a physical manifestation of hell for those who had tragically died without redemption. Marcos, now aware of his own death, tried to resist the truth, but the bus kept moving, and the road ahead seemed endless. The passenger with the hat returned to the back of the bus, quietly watching as Marcos succumbed to despair. At every stop, new passengers boarded, their newly arrived souls, still unaware that they were trapped in the same cycle of terror. The woman with the distorted face turned to Marcos one last time. "Now you understand. You're part of the bus, part of the cycle. Each of us drives to the end, and when we get there, we start all over again." Marcos knew he would never escape. The bus would continue for all eternity, and he was doomed to travel the road of the forgotten, carrying with him the echoes of other lost souls. The final destination would never arrive, and the cycle would never end. He was dead, and condemned to drive forever. The legend of the last night bus was real after all. But what no one knew was that once you boarded, you never got off.